The first time I came face to face with, well, a foreigner, I suppose is the best way of putting it, because everyone knew everybody else in the village. It's the first time I came into contact with a foreigner. It was with Polish soldiers, who I think the correct term is were bivouacked in the park at the top of the lane in which I was born. It would be in I would have said 1944, almost certainly 1944. There was no sign of a campfire or anything of that kind, but they obviously had a field kitchen or whatever it is the armies call it, where they baked their own bread, lovely crunchy, crisp, crusty loaves, with which they made the most delectable crispy bacon sandwiches. I can honestly say that these were probably the best bacon sandwiches I've ever tasted in my life. It seemed to me anyway, that the smell of their cooking filled the air in the village for as long as they were there. Many years later, in 1979, I actually went to Poland. A sobering exercise, I hasten to add. It was still part of the Soviet bloc. And on landing in Warsaw, we were treated to groups of armed soldiers demanding to see our passports at, I should have said at least 6 times before we got out of the airport. It was not a pleasant situation, and as we left the airfield and journeyed off into Warsaw, it was quite noticeable that nobody smiled. Nobody at all, in fact. And we were met by, presumably, a trade representative of some form or another, who was to be our guide, as it were, during our visit. Now, the man who was obviously none of us could speak. There were 3 of us. One of whom was an ex-Spitfire pilot of Polish extraction, who'd virtually walked across Europe in order to join the RAF during World War II, who could speak 5 or 6 European languages. And he conducted all the conversations we had with this trade representative. Now, I think it's true to say that at the time there were considerable claims that there was no unemployment in Poland. Well, they seemed to me anyway to be sitting people down on every floor of the hotel at every turn at desks, doing precisely nothing in order to sustain their statistics. But the first thing I did at the hotel was the first time we sat down to eat, I asked if they would prepare a crispy bacon sandwich. I don't know why, but it just seemed the thing to do, as given my history, given my youthful experience. Needless to say, unfortunately, as in most of life, one can't go back, and the sandwich was a significant disappointment. I suppose it would be 1946. I was sitting one day on the iron railings just inside the gate to the park when I don't think he was the colonial secretary then, but I think he became that in the Churchill government of, was it 53? But Alan Lennox Boyd, the Conservative Party candidate, or MP for local MP, came up the park in his, I seem to remember it was an open American car, rather extravagant and flamboyant, but he came up the park and he stopped about 15 yards short of the gate. Now there was the park was used for keeping, a farmer kept his cows there, and if the gates were left open, the cows would wander off into the village. And he waved to me to get down off the fence, as I observed him pull up. He waved to me to get down off in a quite agitated fashion, in fact, for me to get down off the fence and open the gate for him. Now, in order to stop the cows going into the village, anybody coming to or from the park in a vehicle had to stop it, get out, open the gate, drive it through, get out again and close the gate, etc., etc. He waved to me. I didn't, as I've said, I think once before in a conversation, I didn't like his attitude. I was about, 7 years of age, I suppose, and but anyway, I got down off the fence and I went and opened the gate. And he accelerated. He didn't acknowledge me at all. He accelerated the car away, not so much as a thank you or a look in my direction. And I remember thinking at the time, is this what people in the village expect from their MP? Now, okay, so I'm only 7 years of age, but there's no call to behave like a pig, whatever your position and whoever you're dealing with. Now, it would be perhaps a couple of years later, I remember my father saying that he hoped that the British people, after the war, after all they'd gone through during the war, would combine or come together in order to turn the United Kingdom into a democracy, where one of his favourite phrases was where everybody got paid a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, etc., etc., and were respected for their endeavours. Recently, or well, in the last few days, what's his name? Mr. Varoufakis is his name, the ex-Greek finance minister, has been in the country and has suggested that he thinks that UK ought to stay inside Europe in order for the peoples of Europe to combine to stop the totalitarian, dictatorial state of affairs and total loss of democracy inside the European Union. Now, my father, as I said, expressed this desire for this to happen in the UK, which it clearly hasn't, and I believe Mr. Varoufakis' opinion or way of approaching this is far too altruistic, and it won't happen. We won't be able to reform the European Union from within. I heard it said on a television programme this evening that we are influential in Europe, and that we and the Germans are the most significant countries when it comes to proposing legislation, which I found quite amusing, in spite of the fact that since David Cameron came to power, I don't know, 70 odd times we've been voted out of hand, as it were, in the European Parliament. the reason that some of our proposals have been carried is that we've simply attached ourselves to the shirt tails of Germany, and nobody votes against Germany. I think they've been defeated in a vote 4 or 5 times, and this was probably stage managed anyway. Germany control Europe. There's no question of that. So, in examining the situation in which we find ourselves, I find that I can only conclude that we should leave. We will not reform the EU from within, so we must do our best to assist other countries to reform it, either by following our lead and leaving, or by our assisting them with our overseas aid budget to insist on democracy. Now, I don't think this will happen, but we've got a better chance of influencing it if we're not inside it. The nonsensical belief by some people that usually expressed by people who've had some position in the European Union is that, of course, the Parliament is made up of this way, and the Commission has put forward certain ideas, and then Parliament votes. It's all claptrap. Everything that goes before Parliament has already been decided. This is not a democratic organisation, and the idea that the European Parliament in any way, shape or form can or will influence the European Union's policies is ludicrous. I mean, everybody can see that it's not so. The other thing which I notice all the time, because I can see no good reason why we shouldn't collaborate with the peoples of Europe. Why shouldn't we? But in order to do that, it really is necessary for them to insist on their national boundaries. Now, I know this is easy for us because we're an island, and it's true to say that most islands are very clear on where their boundaries lie. Our only concern really is with the Scottish border, so to speak. And I believe also in that context that if Scotland believes it's better off inside the European Union and wishes to segregate or depart from the United Kingdom, which incidentally I don't believe its people want to do, but if they decide they'll do that because somebody's bribed them to go in that direction, then I think we should just wish them well and let them go. They'll find out soon enough that it was a suicidal decision. So now I come to the point of suggesting that why we find ourselves in a situation where there's any debate at all. There's no question we can collaborate with Europe, and we can continue to sell into the so-called single market. Anybody would think it was a major ambition of ours to have a huge trade deficit with Europe that nobody wants to talk about, it seems. We're losing vast amounts of money, predominantly to Germany, of course, and we'll lose nothing by opting out. Germans are not going to stop, or the French, if it comes to that, stop selling us goods, given that their industry very heavily relies on them. I think we've got a 60-odd million trade deficit with Europe, and Germany's got an 80-odd billion, I should say, a 60-odd billion deficit with the EU, and Germany has an 80-odd billion surplus. Effectively, we're transferring our money straight across Europe into the Deutsche Bank. Now, if we accept, and we have to accept, I'm afraid, that we as a people have been conditioned, as indeed the attempt is now being made to condition the rest of Europe, to to believe that the multinational companies, banks, etc., we all know who they are and how they've got international tentacles into everything. We are actually controlled by them, and the only way we have any chance whatsoever of removing that control is to leave Europe and fend for ourselves. We're quite capable of doing that. What surprises me most is the nonsensical naivety of some of the people who believe that in some way, shape or form there's a utopia out there that we really ought to subscribe to, which is good for us in business terms, and it's good for us in security terms, and it's good for us in no terms at all. In fact, we'll get far more respect and far more out of the European Union if we're not part of it than we'll ever get from being within, in addition to which it will cost us less. Now, another one of the arguments that's been forthcoming is that we pay a certain amount of money into the European coffers and we get a certain amount of it back, about 50% of what we pay in, and that there are actually people in the United Kingdom who believe that the support that they get in various ways, which is very carefully considered by the Brussels, that there is no way in which a British government would in fact support various people and various industries in the same way that Europe does, in spite of the fact, of course, that Europe's using our money to produce this support. Now, I believe, and as I've advocated on more than one occasion, this is due to the deficiency of our political system, that our population has no confidence in them whatsoever, and it's actually reached the stage, which is disastrous and awful to contemplate, is they now have more faith in an undemocratic, dictatorial Brussels than they do in Westminster. What is it? Somebody said that any country gets the government it deserves. Well, we're certainly seeing that graphically illustrated in recent times. We've had the opportunity, or Europe has had the opportunity to show us its merit since 1973, and who can argue that it's done that? Sure, economies have changed, grown, fallen, done whatever, but they would, wouldn't they, in 40 years? But we have seen our manufacturing industry decimated. We've seen our farming decimated, and now I've actually witnessed a farmer saying that he dreads the thought of leaving the EU because he'll lose his subsidies. I mean, this is an extraordinary situation, and it means that once again the Obamas of this world, and we have that French woman over here from the IMF. How did she get her job, we wonder? I think we all know that. A French woman getting a job in the IMF, at the top of the IMF. Germany's agreed with France to allow her to do it. But to trust her, well, of course we can't. Or listen to what she says. I mean, it's a complete nonsense. Obama, her, etc., etc. I suggest you sit down quietly, as I've recommended on my Twitter page, and listen to the conversation between Varoufakis, Mr. Varoufakis, and Noam Chomsky. Just listen to it. And if you still believe, after you've heard it, that there's any logic in our committing ourselves to a long-term future with that organisation, then I despair. There's no chance of us ever getting down to demanding from our politicians what we need from them. We certainly won't get it from Europe. So we have to fall back on getting it from our own people. I agree they've let us down. I agree they're third rate, and I've said this on more than one occasion. But if we believe we can't change the way they behave, then as I said before, we've got the government we deserve, and we're going to get an even worse one. And if we vote to stay in, we shall certainly deserve it.